I've got the need for speed. No, I'm serious, I have a cocaine problem. Today we are going to do a Siamese modification. I've really been enjoying these Siamese mods, and I haven't done one for a little while, but some of my last 3x3 mods of last year were Siamese mods. I had a really cool heart, double heart cube, whatever that puzzle was, and of course my 150,000 subscriber play button. So I've really been enjoying the edge fused Siamese cubes. I feel like I've done quite a lot of the corner ones. What I want to do today is I want to try and building a cone. Now I've done cylinders before, and I've even done hexagonal dipyramids before, but I've never done a cone shape. So I really want to challenge myself today and see if one of these is possible, and I'm sure I could do it with just a 3x3, but I want to challenge myself a little further and fuse these two puzzles together before I get about doing it. Now some of you guys have asked, and I shall reiterate, this is a triple fused 3x3. This kind of puzzle doesn't work. It's no different to a regular fuse cube modification. You got the outside puzzle that turns on 3 faces on either side, but the one on the inside doesn't move at all. It's completely locked in place, so there's no point doing any more than 2 for a fuse cube modification. I did actually make a video on this, but it's been sitting out of shot and a lot of people have asked some questions, so I figured I'd just answer that once again right there. Now to do a fuse cube modification is really simple. In fact, it's up there with some of the simplest modifications and even some of the first modifications that you should be trying if you want to get into this whole puzzle modding scene. And the reason it's so damn simple is because you don't even have to do any cutting or filling. All you have to do is take some pieces out and then glue some stuff together. In fact, it really is a no epoxy modification when you think about it. Alright, so before we even start with this modification, I want to fuse these two 3x3s together. Now, I've done this so many times that I usually speed through it in a lot of my other Siamese modification builds, but today I'm going to slow things down a little bit and I'm actually going to walk you through the process of fusing these two puzzles together on their corners. It's actually very, very simple. Now to do this, you're going to need a screwdriver and some super glue, and that's pretty much it. So I'm going to start by disassembling both of these, and I'm going to pull the core out of them. Alright, so we got the two cores now. This is just the 6-arm core of a regular 3x3, or Rubik's Cube to the layman. And you can see here, if I press the two cores together like this, they kind of interlock in this band around the center. And what that does is that fuses the two cores together so that 3 axes can still turn, but the other 3 are locked and they never move again. Now this might seem just like one of many in my little bag of tricks to build different kinds of puzzles of different shapes and sizes, but it's actually a very, very useful tactic for making slightly larger, longer things that don't really fit into a regular puzzle's mechanism. I've used this to make stuff like my extremely large hexagonal prism. I've even made a knife handle. It's a very, very universal way of just making a big block of material that I can then shape into something that I want. And it also kind of looks a lot cooler too. Okay, so what I'm going to do is nothing special. I'm just going to take one of these cores and I'm going to place some super glue on 2 of these surfaces here, here, and here. And what that's going to do is just put some super glue there so I can interlock it with the other core, and then they're just going to fuse together. Now one thing I should point out before you do this, you've only got one shot. If you screw it up, you're not going to be able to pry them apart, and if you do, the surfaces are going to be terrible and you're going to have to sand everything back, and it's just a total pain to fix it all. So you want to make sure you get this right the first time. And it's just a little bit of super glue that's kind of leaked out the side here and very politely deprived me of some of my finger skin, so I'm just going to scrape that off. And now that this is all glued together, I might just leave it for a little bit to make sure that everything dries up, and after I've done that, I can just start reassembling the puzzle as is. Now, a cool thing about this puzzle is not only is it very simple to build, but you actually end up with a few spare pieces left over after you're done with this build, so you'll be able to use those in later projects if you choose to do them. And while I'm at it... oh, bugger. And while I'm at it, I'm going to peel these stickers off on the inside faces of the core. The reason I'm doing this is because they're going to kind of interfere with the turning quality of the puzzle, and I'll have to remove some of the sticker residue as well. So that is the two cores fused together. Now if you're building a regular old fuse cube, you can just reassemble the pieces right here and now, and you don't have to do anything more. And if you pay attention to the layout of the stickers, you won't even have to re-sticker it. It depends on which flavor you prefer. But for me, I'm going to be filling all of the gaps between these pieces, and then I'm going to be reassembling the puzzle. And I'm going to use some epoxy sculpt, which is my material of choice, to do that. Alright, so now I'm going to press the epoxy sculpt in between the pieces. Very, very simple. Just take off a small piece, roll it up nice and thin, break off any excess, and then just press it into the little gap here. Alright, so that is done. As you can see here, I've got all of the epoxy sculpt pressed in between the center pieces. What I'm going to do is I'm going to let that cure, and then after it's cured, I'm going to sand these areas flat. Then I'm going to reassemble the puzzle with all those pieces over there. And if you want to speed up the curing process, I have an entire video on making epoxy sculpt set really, really fast. I'm not going to bother with that because I got other stuff to do today, so I can let this cure naturally. But if you're short for time, you can try that method. I'll leave a link to that video on screen and in the description as well.
6.5 hours later.
So what I'm doing now is I'm just sanding down these areas of epoxy sculpt so that they're flush with the pieces. After I've sanded all these areas down, I can reassemble the puzzle, and then I can get back to treating it as just a regular puzzle modification. And I'm also using a nail file to do this, which is my preferred sanding apparatus of choice. Although it does have to be said, if there is a little too much epoxy sculpt, you can always use a blade of some kind to just scrape it away. But I like to avoid using a blade because sometimes you can accidentally pull out the entire piece of epoxy sculpt that you've pushed in there, and then you have to either redo it or find the piece that you've just flicked out and glue it back in place, neither of which is a pleasant thing to do. Oh, the countless hours of an evening that I have spent doing this. Alright, so that is pretty much sanded smooth. I'm going to take this 400 grit sanding block, just go over everything, make it look nice. But I don't really have to spend too much time on this right now, seeing as how I'm not really going to have to round over all of the pieces of the puzzle until the very end of the build. But it's just nice to make sure everything's nice and smooth before I start reassembling everything. That being said, again, you don't have to do this. Now the best way to reassemble this kind of puzzle is to take two center caps off, one on each of the cores. Just like that. Okay, so now that that is all assembled, one last thing to do before I start cutting this thing up or marking it out or doing anything like that is I'm going to tighten up all of the centers that I still have access to. The reason I'm doing this is because, much like with a regular 3x3, you want to tighten everything up before you start cutting into it. Otherwise the pieces can do a half rotation while you're in the middle of cutting stuff on the bandsaw. And if it snags on the blade, it'll explode and it'll take your hand along with it. And I work with my hands. I like my hands. And I want to keep them in good shape. Wonderful. And of course, like I said before, I still have a few pieces left over which would have accommodated the corners that I have since fused together. So you can hold on to these as spare pieces for a later project, although of course I have an entire box full of them. Alright, it's time to do a thing. So I don't really know how this cone shape, which is of course the puzzle that I'm going to be building, it's like 10 minutes into this video and I haven't even started cutting anything yet. I don't really know how this cone shape is going to work, but I do know it's going to have one flat spot that is going to be on one of these corners. So what I'm going to start by doing is I'm going to cut off one of these corners nice and flat so I have some facet to work from to figure out the rest of the build. So I'm going to take this over to my bandsaw and I'm just going to cut one of the corners off as deep as I dare. And of course, I can't believe it's not butter. I'm not going to be using 45 degrees, which is my most common degree of choice. I'm going to be using 35 degrees. 35 degrees is what you want if you want to cut off, whoops. 35 degrees is the angle you want if you want to cut off the corner so it's perfectly perpendicular to the corner axis. So let's give this a shot. And that's looking pretty sweet. That's a nice cut. It's a little shallow for my taste, but I don't want to go to full depth just yet. Full depth being just about this corner to this corner worth of depth, which is about a 5 or 6 more millimeters in. So I'm going to leave this as is, and I'm going to figure out how I'm going to turn this damn thing into a cone, which is probably going to take a little more forethought than I usually put into my builds. Before I got ahead of myself and started cutting into this puzzle, I figured I would start by gluing up some of the pieces to make sure that the layers couldn't turn while I was cutting it on the bandsaw. Although I had tightened all the faces up, this is just an extra level of insurance and it's a safety precaution that I sometimes like to take. Now I figured the best way to go about making a cone was to treat it very similarly to making a cylinder. So I took the puzzle over to my bandsaw and I cut off the small corner on the opposite side of the puzzle so that I could spin it between my fingers. You see, one of the main problems with making a cylindrical puzzle is that you have to make sure both ends are the exact same diameter, but with a cone, that wouldn't be an issue, seeing as how they would be different diameters. I used some cutting pliers to clear out the inside of the piece that I just cut, and now it was time to figure out which pieces I was going to cut off to begin this cone shape. I knew I was going to have to remove some material and make a few slopes on the side of the puzzle so that I could get it started on the belt sander, but I didn't know which parts to cut off. After looking over the puzzle for a while, I figured out the best way to cut the puzzle was to cut a line from here to here. If I did this 6 times around the outside of the puzzle, I'll remove enough on one side and leave enough on the other to give this enough of a pronounced cone shape without ruining it. If that makes any sense at all. After cutting off just a couple of the edges, you can see the kind of shape that I'm going for here, but I still had a few more to cut off. It was a little tough trying to line up the pieces perfectly to make sure I was cutting everything off very precisely, but all of this would get sanded off anyway. After the last bit of cutting was done, I still had a very pronounced hexagonal shape, so I sanded off some of the sharper edges to make things easier to turn once I started spinning this puzzle between my fingers. After I'd sanded those small pieces off, it was time to take it back over to my belt sander and start spinning the puzzle between my fingers just like a regular cylinder. One side was much wider than the other side, as was kind of to be expected, but I ended up having to hold the puzzle in a very specific way so that I could just spin it freely.
As the puzzle decreased in size, this became less of an issue, but starting the puzzle off was a bit of a challenge. The more I sanded the puzzle, the more I really understood the shape of the cone and how it fit into the shape of the puzzle, and by the time I was done sanding everything, this is what the puzzle looked like. Unfortunately, I couldn't go any deeper than this, and this is the reason why.
Okay, so there is a problemo with this puzzle. So I've kind of got the shape that I'm looking for here, and I'm very happy with how it's looking so far, but I want to go about 2mm deeper into this shape profile. And I can't do that because these screws are in the way. Now, I'm going to have to reduce the diameter of these screws and sink them down a little deeper into the centerpieces so that I can get those extra couple of millimeters. This is something that's not the easiest thing in the world to do. I have made a video on it before, but it's worth a little bit more of an in-depth explanation. What I'm going to have to do is very simply remove the screws, and then I can start fiddling around with this puzzle. I am going to have to disassemble half of it, which I am not happy about, but it's all going to go back together in the end anyway. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to reduce the diameter of the head of the screw so that it can still hold on to the tiny little springs here, but it can also slip inside the smaller diameter circle inside the centerpiece. That means that I'm going to have a little bit more room to reduce the size of the cone shape.
One of the easiest ways that I've found to decrease the head of a screw in size is to chuck it in my drill and then sand it up against the side of my belt sander. This is a really easy and also incredibly accurate way of sanding down the head of a screw, and after I finish sanding everything, I can check it with one of the centerpieces to make sure that everything fits.
Okay, so now that the puzzle is reassembled, I don't have to go back over to the belt sander and start sanding. I can, but I'm not going to bother. Instead, I'm just going to fill all of the cavities that I can see right now, and then after all the epoxy sculpt is set, then I'm going to take it back over to the belt sander. It saves me a little time. So let's start filling all of the pieces.
From this point forth in the build, I was really only going to be focusing on getting the shape correct. Because I wouldn't have to disassemble anything to fill all of the pieces, after all the epoxy sculpt was cured, this puzzle was pretty much ready to go to take straight back over to the belt sander and continue with the shaping. Now with all the pieces filled, the puzzle spun between my fingers a lot smoother than it did before, and I was a lot more confident in getting the shape that I was looking for. That being said, the puzzle still had a tendency to oscillate slightly, and that introduced a couple of surface defects that I ended up having to take some extra time to sand out as I was getting this puzzle to its final shape. After I'd gotten the top half of the cone as narrow as I dared, it was now time to disassemble the puzzle so that I could extend all of the pieces. I had used some superglue to keep all of the pieces in place, so after I had disassembled everything, I had to break some of the pieces apart. After roughening up the surface of the pieces, I used some epoxy sculpt to build out the shape on all of the areas that needed to be extended. After all the pieces were cured, I took them over to my belt sander and I sanded down all of the interior faces so that I could reassemble the puzzle. I wasn't going to worry about the exterior shape of the puzzle right now, since I would deal with that once the puzzle was assembled. I used a nail file to further sand down all of the interior faces, and I also used a 400 grit sanding block just to further smooth everything over. After all those pieces were done, I reassembled the puzzle, and this is what it looked like. To start sanding this puzzle, I focused on all of the high points first to try and get this puzzle as uniform and conical as possible before I started spinning it between my fingers. This just makes sure there isn't as much bumpiness and shaking around while I'm sanding the puzzle later on. I also did some extra pieces like the center caps and the top of the cone off camera because those pieces needed a little extra TLC. And now that the final shape was complete, I was pretty much on the home stretch with one last thing to do.
And for this, I'm going to need the wonderful 100mm telemacro. This will only hurt a bit.
I used a nail file, which is my preferred sanding tool of choice, to round over all of the very sharp edges on each of the pieces. I also used a 400 grit sanding block and some Scotch-Brite to further round over all of the pieces and make each of them nice and smooth. And finally, I had to cut out some small pieces of tape to cover over the screw heads, that way I could stuff those pieces in with some epoxy sculpt and finish this puzzle up.
I would like to apologize for the camera quality, but this is not very easy to film. God damn it.
Now that I had the puzzle at a tension I was happy with, I used a small piece of epoxy sculpt to cover over each of the screw heads, with that tape acting as a barrier between it and the piece. And now the final step for building this puzzle is of course cutting all of the stickers for each of the pieces. Now I absolutely hate cutting stickers and I'm terrible at it too, but this time I decided to really try my hardest and pour a lot of time and effort into cutting these stickers out, and I think the result is actually fantastic. These are probably some of the best stickers that I've ever cut on a puzzle before, and here it is, the cone is finally complete. This has taken me a very long time to build, and I am very happy to see this puzzle finally completed. Now, because I'd never done a cone before, I figured I'd use a 4-color scheme for this puzzle, although I used white on the bottom because it just looked a little nicer. Now, because this puzzle is a Siamese cube, it does have 2 separate 3x3s and they do function independently from one another. They don't switch pieces, but they still scramble and shapeshift, so I think this puzzle looks really cool when it's scrambled, and it's probably going to be a pretty good challenge to solve. Overall, I think I'm very happy with how this puzzle turned out, and I'm really glad that I chose to do a Siamese modification as opposed to just a regular 3x3 mod. One of my favorite things about what I do here on YouTube is I get to challenge myself and try stuff that I didn't think I could do before. And although the results aren't always perfect, the more I try, the more I learn, and the less I have to try next time. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.
I could have done that worse. You know, like if I died or something.